Everyone, please welcome Professor Tim O'Brien.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't know what Fiona said. There was a round of applause at one point in the middle of her thing, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. So it was something that's... What? Co-founder of Blue Dot, of course, which is why we're all here. Thank you for sticking with us. It's been a challenging weekend, hasn't it? But we do our best to manage it as best we can. So what I'm going to talk about today, as the title suggests, is the secret history of Jodrell Bank. And this is something that it's a story, parts of which have been told before, but quite a bit of it we've not told before because many of us didn't even know it because we weren't allowed to know it because it was indeed top secret. But recently we built a new exhibition in a new building here in the visitor facility. And as part of that, I decided I wanted to find out whether the rumors of secret activities were true. And the rumours involved working with GCHQ, which is the government communications headquarters, who are the people who intercept signals for lots of reasons in the defence of the realm. And so I thought, okay, how do I get hold of GCHQ? I'll go to their website. And I went to the website, and funnily enough, they had a little web form box on it that had inquiries, and you can type in a question. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll try that. And I put in and I said, okay, what am I? Of the options, I decided I was media, which is not quite true. And then I typed in, I work at Jodrell Bank, and I've heard there's been rumours for a long time that GCHQ used to use Jodrell Bank, and I wanted to know whether it was true or not because we're doing this exhibition. Could someone get in touch? And there wasn't like black helicopters flying in and things, but I did actually get a reply from the historian, the person who looks after their archive, David Abratat, and he contacted me, and so we were able to sort of examine their archive and reveal some of the stories that I'll tell you today. So just to begin at the beginning for Jodrell Bank, the beginning of Jodrell Bank was in late 1945. And Bernard Lovell, who started the observatory here, he was a physicist in Manchester in the Department of Physics before the Second World War. And he worked on things called cosmic rays, particles that arrive from out of space, moving at near the speed of light. And at the outset of war, in fact, he was just packing his van with all his equipment to drive down to the Pyrenees to go to the top of a mountain to study these particles that arrive from space. And his boss, who was sort of well in with the government, said to him, you know, Bernard, I wouldn't drive across Europe at the moment. And this was August of 1939. And so when war broke out the next month, war was declared, he was sort of drafted in, as many physicists were, to work on the war effort. And he worked on radar. And he led a team that developed airborne radar, the sort of classic thing you see with a thing that sweeps around a screen. So they were using it to basically image the ground in radio waves for various reasons, looking for submarines, surface submarines, plotting out things for bombing raids and so on. And at the end of the war, they basically said, he got an OBE for that at the end of the war. He met Churchill and everything else. He was very much involved. And it probably, almost certainly, the devices he built helped win the Battle of the Atlantic, which was basically the convoys that were coming across from the USA to help supply Europe that were being sunk by the Nazi submarines, the U-boats. And so they worked out the radar was very helpful there. So he was chucked out of the army at the end of the war, or the group that he was in, and sent back to the university. And I remember him moaning to me. He said, you know, when I came back, like a few weeks before, I'd been able to order up 3 bombers to do this thing. And then when I got back to the university, I couldn't even get a screwdriver from physics stores. It was, which, you know, to be honest, is a similar story these days. But it was a real shock to the system. But he thought, okay, what am I going to do? I'll carry on my study of cosmic rays, these particles, but maybe I'll use the radar technology that I've developed. So what he was trying to do was use a radar which sends out a radio pulse, a radio wave pulse, sends it up into the sky, and he thought he could bounce it back off the trail that the cosmic ray particle leaves in the atmosphere. So when it rips through the atmosphere at very high speed, it rips electrons from the molecules and the atoms in the atmosphere, and you leave an ionized trail. And the radio waves ought to bounce back off that. So he brought his equipment out here to Jodrell Bank. He actually brought it out into Manchester, and he couldn't do the work because the trams outside the university were interfering with his work. They were producing radio interference that stopped him seeing stuff. He came to a site which is just over here, where the university had the botany grounds, and he set up his radar here. He actually didn't detect cosmic rays and never detected cosmic rays. What he detected instead were flat echoes coming from meteors, from shooting stars. And that was what turned him into an astronomer. So before that, he wasn't interested in astronomy, really. He was just interested in these, very narrow interest in these cosmic rays. So he sort of became an astronomer by chance. In fact, we never detected echoes from cosmic rays, so the whole reason for Jodrell Bank existed. It exists on a failure to detect cosmic rays. And his excuse was, he said, well, he did the calculations to show that this should work, and he did it while he was on an air base that was being attacked at the time, and he made a mistake in his calculation, and he got it wrong by a factor of several thousand. So the signal was several thousand times weaker than he expected. If he'd realized his mistake before he came to Jodrell Bank, we wouldn't be here today. So there we go, chance again. So when he came and he realized that he could detect meteors with radar, he also realized that there were radio waves that were actually originating in space. They were actually coming from the distant universe. They weren't radar, they weren't things that we were sending out and getting an echo back from. They came from way out there. And he got really interested in that. And what he needed to study these things was a very big telescope. So he designed, with an engineer called Charles Husband, he designed and built the big telescope that's here today, the Lovell Telescope. They began work on that in 1952. And it was, nobody had built anything like that in the world before. It was, it's a remarkable thing when you see the pictures there. There's something like 90 miles of scaffolding that were used in the construction of that thing. They had to invent a mechanism for building cranes. They had to build cranes that built bigger cranes that built bigger cranes to sort of create this thing. And for that reason, it took them far longer than they expected. It cost them far more money than they expected. And really, by that sort of late summer of 1957, so 5 years later, they were in serious trouble. They were in a huge debt. The workers weren't being paid. They'd gone on strike. The newspapers were full of this story. In the end, that headline is true. They had a public appeal, and people sent in pocket money to save the project. But at that time, summer of 1957, it was in huge debt. And I've got a little recording of Sir Bernard speaking about this a few years later.
I said to Henry Brown, we need a miracle to save us. Well, that kind of miracle came on October the 4th, a few weeks later, 1957, when the Sputnik 1 was launched.
So the thing that basically saved the project at that time was a completely chance occurrence, nothing to do with Jodrell Bank. The Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. And Jodrell was, at first Lovell wasn't interested in it because it was basically this sort of beach ball sized thing that went ping, had a radio transmitter on it, and it was to demonstrate the supremacy of the Soviet system. So it orbited the Earth, and it sent out a radio signal, went ping, everybody could hear it. And Lovell was like, well, this is not, we're building a telescope to look at, distant galaxies or planets or stars. It's nothing to do with this thing. But then he got a phone call from somebody in government, and they said, is there any chance you could put a radar transmitter on the telescope and use that to get an echo back, not from the Sputnik satellite itself, but from the rocket that had carried Sputnik into space. The reason they were interested in that was because at the time this was a secret reason, but the reason they were interested in it was because that rocket was itself an intercontinental ballistic missile. And so the fear was that the next thing that might be launched wouldn't be something like a beach ball thing that goes ping, but would be some sort of nuclear weapon. And so detecting the rockets would be an early warning idea for detecting the missiles coming over the horizon. So basically, everybody came back into work, and they very quickly, within about 10 days, managed to get the telescope in a sort of near enough working order, and they did indeed get an echo from the Sputnik rocket. This is a model of the Sputnik rocket in our new exhibition, and a model of Sputnik above it. A really good model of Sputnik rocket there. I spent a long time trying to find out what that looked like, because it's actually not very well known, because it was a secret thing at the time. And there's Lovell in the background pointing at the echo they got from that rocket. So that, again, the telescope was sort of in the press, became sort of world famous for that sort of activity. Now, this is something we did not know until, or I did not know, there was really only, at the time that we were doing this, only one person left who knew this, which is that at the launch of Sputnik, a GCHQ staff member was posted to Jodrell Bank. So effectively a spy was sent to Jodrell Bank to work here, obviously undercover, to work with some of the people here to use the telescope to sort of study. Of course, you know, when you think about it, it's obvious. It's the Soviet Union launching rockets that might carry nuclear missiles, and this telescope was unique in the world. It was the biggest radio telescope in the world. It was the best facility for studying this, you know, new era of things in space. It was the dawn of the space age. And these are a few pictures that the GCHQ people have given to us. Where you can see, for example, at the top, there's a picture that one of them had taken of the early telescope. One of the GCHQ staff in the middle, standing on the tower at the top. He's far enough away that you can't see who it is. In the picture at the bottom, the faces are redacted. So we don't know who those people are, but they're basically GCHQ people standing in what's called Lab 5, which is just above our control room. And that's where a lot of this operations happened. So this relationship with GCHQ went on for quite a long time. We don't really know exactly how long. I don't know what I don't know. It's an unknown unknown, as Donald Rumsfeld, if any of you remember him, would say. I only know what I've been told. And this picture clearly is not that long ago. This is not a 1950s picture at the bottom. I don't know when it was taken. I haven't been told that. It looks like early 90s, late 80s, something like that, judging by the pullovers. But hard to say. But basically, that relationship went on for really quite a long time. And that was that quote at the bottom of that slide. It says the relationship was aimed to intercept signals from Soviet reconnaissance satellites, orbital weapons, and space probes. So that's directly from the secret archives. The few Jodrell staff that knew about this, there were of course only going to be a few people who would know about it. These are the three main people at Jodrell Bank that knew what was going on. On the right we have Bernard Lovell. In the middle we have John Davis, J.G. Davis he was known as, and on the left Bob Pritchard. Sir Bernard died in 2012, I think it was. J.G. Davis a while before that, and Bob sadly died just last year. But I've talked to Bob a lot about these things. In fact, I did a conversation with Bob at Blue Dot on the stage a few years ago. I don't know whether anybody was in the audience for that. And it was always funny talking to Bob, because he would tell you about the things he was allowed to tell you about. It was very obvious when he stopped talking that he got to the point where he knew he wasn't supposed to be saying anything. It was and he was very good, right? He definitely kept his part of the bargain. Of course, he'd signed the Official Secrets Act. I was pleased, actually, to be able to speak to GCHQ and speak to Bob. And I said to the GCHQ people, rang up Bob, telephoned him and said, long retired, and said, it's okay, you can talk about this stuff now. And so he was able to tell people, including his family, about the things he'd been involved with that he'd kept secret all those years before he died. So that was a nice thing. I felt that I helped a little bit with that. Here's just to illustrate the point. If you wander around Jodrell Bank, you find lots of old things, not just me, but and telescopes. And we don't tidy up. Well, we've got other things to worry about, quasars and supermassive black holes and stuff. But it's one of the reasons why we've got this sort of archive of interesting stuff, because people don't throw everything away. There have been things that have been thrown away that I wish hadn't, but there's a lot of things randomly. And this is if anybody here works for someone like BT or someone, they might recognize these sorts of cards, but it's basically sitting in our switchboard cupboard. If you open the door, there's a little folder holder on the inside of the door, and there's a bunch of cards in. This is a photo of one of the cards that's still there today, but you can see it says Lab 5 upstairs. Lab 5 was where the picture of the GCHQ people were taken. It was also where the picture of Sir Bernard and J.G. Davis and Bob Pritchard was taken. And then it says PW to Cheltenham, and to Cheltenham at the bottom. Cheltenham is where the headquarters of GCHQ is, and PW stands for private wire. So basically they had a private link to GCHQ that was fed to that Lab 5. So, the evidence for this, you can gather the evidence. That was probably supposed to have been destroyed. I'm not sure that should have been visible, but it is there anyway. It's one of the reasons we knew that there was some truth in this rumor. Okay. So I mentioned that the telescope, the first thing the telescope did was actually a defense-related project. We might know about Sputnik as the first satellite, but the reason Jodrell was involved was a defense-related thing. That actually grew into really quite an important role at the time of what's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in October of 1962, it was realized that the Soviet Union had placed some sort of medium-range nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles, on Cuba. Cuba, of course, at that time, certainly being an ally of the Soviet Union. And they were, of course, within reach, as this map shows at the bottom there. They were in easy reach. Cuba's just in the Caribbean. It's within easy reach of the United States. And so it was really quite a frightening time, and probably the closest we've ever come to an all-out nuclear war. What happened then was that the Jodrell Telescope was brought into use. And the reason was the official early warning system wasn't finished. So anybody driven across the North Yorkshire Moors to Whitby, and you can go past a place called Fylingdales. And what Fylingdales used to look like is it used to be these big golf ball things. There's still some of those at Menwith Hill, which is another US Air Force base nearby. But inside those golf balls, there's actually a dish that rotates, and it sends out radar, and it gets echoes back from things like missiles, aircraft, enemy aircraft, whatever. And the golf ball, I suppose partly it hides what technology you've got inside it, but also it's a wind protection, because high wind can stop you operating your telescope. So it means you can continue operating in high wind. Those golf balls have now been replaced by a very Cold War looking structure. It's a sort of concrete pyramid thing. And I think it has 3 faces with circular discs on them. Which each of those discs is what's called a phased array radar. So it electronically points a radar in lots of different directions at the same time. So it doesn't need a dish to move around. It just sort of sits with 3 of them facing around. And it effectively creates, that system effectively creates a giant hemisphere above the station, a huge hemisphere, which the people who operate, the RAF team who operate that radar and are operating it today, as we speak, if some object passes through the surface of that hemisphere and that object isn't on their database, it sets off an alarm. And it might be an aircraft that they don't know about, or it might be a missile or whatever. And there's a bunch of these systems like this from like Alaska, northern USA, Greenland, and they basically create a sort of an invisible sort of curtain that sort of gives us warning of something that we aren't otherwise aware. But at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Fylingdales system at the top there was not yet completed. So Jodrell Bank had to step in. And I'll just play you a recording I've got of Sir Bernard talking about this.
I was then one of the scientific advisor to the Chief of Air Staff, and in the late 1950s, he said, is there any chance that we could make use of your telescope? And I said, why? He said, well, Findingdales, the ballistic missile early warning station, is hindered by strikes, and if we have your permission, we'd like to use your telescope instead until it's available. And I said, of course, we can, if you can tell us where the Soviets have the missiles directed against London, we can tell you when they lift off, but we can do nothing else. And I said, neither can you. He said, no, but if you could give us a few minutes warning, we could save 1 million lives in London.
So the idea...
who, with the Chief of Air Staff, covered the acute period of the severe Cold War, including the Cuban crisis. And that, of course, was an unforgettable occasion. Fortunately, in about a year afterwards, Findingdales became operational, and we were then released from all national commitments of that kind.
So yeah, so it was a sort of standby system. We actually had RAF teams of RAF staff had been trained to operate the telescope. We had a radar installed. There's an example of the radar system shown in top left there. It's not the one at Jodrell Bank, but it's the same type, where there's 2 operators to make sure that it's not just reliant on one person who might make a mistake. There's 2 of them who independently assess the signals. And they actually housed that device in this hut. So the hut that's visible in this central picture on the left, it's called Radiant Hut, and it's still there today. And it was in a room on the right-hand side of that hut. And this is a sort of illustration of the sort of beam of the telescope looking out towards Eastern Europe, where from secret information they knew where the missile launch sites were. This is just a picture from the National Archives that my colleague Simon Garrington found. It actually has on the left-hand side, it has a map of Jodrell Bank. This is from what was a secret document, and it shows you sort of where you come in. South is at the top here, and you come in, and this is the Radiant Hut, and it shows you, it says RAF Jodrell Bank in this room here, and then you come around here, and this is our control building, this sort of curved thing, and the telescope is over here. And then this is a zoom in of the hut. So it shows you that there's a room here, the RAF room, it says, and this is where the 2 radar consoles are. But the really funny, the really hilarious thing about this, to be honest, next to it, that writing at the top says, workshop in which Russian students work. It says, workshop extends behind RAF room to include photographic developing room. And then along the walls, it says, this wall soundproofed. This wall not soundproofed. Which, you know, what a weird thing, right? So at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there were RAF people sitting at Jodrell Bank in that room, waiting to use the telescope to give us a 7-minute warning or whatever it was of nuclear attack, which, you know, would have saved some people, all right, but not everybody. I doubt it would have saved millions of lives in London, like Sir Bernard said, because there wouldn't be space for millions of people to get in some underground bunker, but some people would have. But that was there. And right in the same hut, there were students from the Soviet Union here at Jodrell Bank on a research project. And here they are, actually. These are the two students with Sir Bernard at that time. It's Haruni and Tovmassian are the two students. They're actually from Armenia, so not Russia, but part of the Soviet Union, certainly. And that's basically because we continued scientific collaborations throughout the Cold War. It wasn't, you know, it may have been a difficult time politically, very difficult time politically, but scientifically there was still ongoing collaborations and visits backwards and forwards. And of course that had some benefits to the intelligence community as well, on both sides. So these people would visit Jodrell Bank. Here's Alla Masevich, who was a top Soviet scientist, rocket scientist. She visited Jodrell Bank a number of times. Yuli Kudarev is in the background. They came in 1961, so the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, to help use the telescope to search for a spacecraft they'd sent to Venus. They came with a person who, walked around with them in a dark suit and pretended not to be able to speak English. So apparently that would be their minder, their KGB minder would have been with them. And so there was some sort of, obviously it was this sort of delicate balancing point, but the scientific collaboration was real. Really did do proper scientific work between the two sides in that environment. Lovell actually was invited to visit the Soviet Union in 1963. On a return visit, Masevich hosted him, Alla Masevich. But when he got there, they immediately said, "Oh, we've changed the schedule. We're going to take you on a visit to the Crimea." Of course, we all know where the Crimea is from current political situation with Ukraine. And they went down to the Crimea, to the coast of the Black Sea, and they basically gave him a tour of their top secret tracking facilities. And this is a picture of one of the telescopes that he described when he came back with the sort of 8 dishes on a mount. And if you're adept at using web searching, you can find a lot of information like the thing on the right, because the Americans tend to declassify a lot of stuff and put it on the web, and you can if you use the right phrases to search for things, you can find interesting declassified documents, which is what this information is from. It's at a place called Yevpatoria. And the people there we still work with today. There's radio telescopes there now that we link to as part of our networks, and we still collaborate with scientists in Crimea, in Russia, and so on. But they took him there, and it was a bit surprising. Here's the Daily Express. This is an article in the Daily Express from 2012. Beautiful boffins bid to woo Newton of radio astronomy to defect to USSR. They actually got hold of an ex-KGB person who gave them some interesting quotes and basically said the plan was to get Alla Masevich to persuade Lovell to defect. This is Sir Bernard Lovell talking about it. With any luck. No. It's okay. What he says is basically, he says that he went to a luncheon with a person who was the head of the scientific sort of commission in the Soviet Union, and they basically said to him, what are you planning to do next? And he said, I want to build an even bigger telescope. And he said, how much is it going to cost? And he says, probably about £4 million. And they said, we could give you that as an annual budget if you were to stay here and work with us. And his response was, I am an Englishman and I want to return to England. But he was actually very concerned that he would be let out of the country. They did give him his passport back and he did come back. But when he came back, he was actually very ill. And he had a set of diaries that he said shouldn't be opened until after he died. So, of course, when he died, I was on a campsite in Anglesey the night he died, and I got a phone call from the BBC security correspondent the next morning to say, Sir Bernard's died, can we see his diaries? I was like, well, give us a chance. He's only just died. So we came back, we did look at his diaries, and in it there's lots of interesting information. They are online now in our John Rylands library in the archive. And one of the things he revealed was that he had a sort of debriefing session with the intelligence agents when he came back, and they have said to him, well, you might be ill because they've tried to poison you to remove your memory. We're never sure whether the truth of that or not, or whether he was simply so stressed by that whole experience that it was that made him ill. We did sort of really some interesting things hacking into some of the space probes. Of course, the reason this was some of this became public, and actually that's a photograph of the Daily Express again. showing the pictures, the very first pictures ever taken from the surface of the moon. And they were taken by a Soviet spacecraft that landed on the moon in February of 1966, no people on it, a robotic spacecraft. It took photographs of the moon's surface. They were developed on board the spacecraft automatically. They were scanned with a little light that runs along through the negative. That turns it into an electrical signal that's turned into a radio signal that's broadcast back to Earth. And it sort of envelops the whole Earth, and so we could listen in. And J.G. Davis, who I showed you earlier, he recognized the form of the signal, and he said, oh, it sounds like one of these sort of almost newfangled fax machines. It's a newspaper picture receiver. And so the Daily Express actually brought one of these things into Jodrell. They plugged it into the telescope, and out came the very first picture sent from the surface of the moon. So they basically hacked into this Soviet signal. Now, you know, that was in the news, partly because it was the Daily Express that had given them the picture receiver. You couldn't really avoid it. But what wasn't really known, I think, you might have guessed, but basically the recordings basically went on to GCHQ and then on to US intelligence. And they're interested basically in what is the capability of the Soviet technology. So they're interested in analysing as much as they can about the capabilities. And a similar example is this project. This was something called, if you did a web search for something called Project Flower Garden, you'll find out a bit about this. But it was basically, of course, we had Fylingdales and all these other missile defense radar. The Soviet Union had their own versions of this. And you're interested in seeing how these things work. What we did at Jodrell Bank, we were part of this project secretly, and we actually did a thing where we took the radio. I keep looking up at the Earth, imagining that's the Earth, and this is great, isn't it? So you imagine Jodrell Bank sitting on the Earth with its telescope, and you point it up at the moon. We should have got the moon model as well. That would help my talk. You point the telescope at the moon, and what happens is this radar system that's being sent out all the time by the Soviet Union, however it works, is just heading off. It doesn't come back as an echo, it just heads off into space. And some of it hits the moon, and then some of it reflects off the moon and comes back to the Earth. So if you point your telescope at the moon, you can pick up signals that have bounced back off the moon from their radar system, and then you can analyze them and work out what their radar system's like. You know how strong it is, you know what sort of encoding it uses, and so this was a big project. And Jodrell's role, they called them the hen house was the radar. It was because people thought it looked like a hen house. These two wings are the two radar systems here. This is a spy satellite photograph of somewhere, I'm not sure where that is, in one of the satellite countries of Russia in the Soviet Union. Sarishaga it's called. So they actually, you know, again, that was, we measured the strength of that signal, which was a very important. We knew what the power of their radar was. Obviously, the idea would be you could then work out how to jam it or avoid being detected by it, perhaps. Coming back to something we've all heard about is the Eagle lander, that Jodrell Bank tracked the Eagle lander onto the moon. And the little trace there, the sort of graph on the right-hand side, is the signal from a telescope, a small telescope called the 50-foot. And we have another one called the 42-foot there at the moment. If you look at the Jodrell Bank site just over there, you'll see a smaller telescope. It's the 42-foot. Somebody broke the 50-foot, and we had to replace it with a 42-foot. But we still use it today. They used it to track the signal from the Eagle lander, and the little wibbles where Neil Armstrong had to take manual control of the lander and fly it over the rough ground and find a flat patch to land on. And basically the landing is bang on when the signal goes straight. So right at the point where the wibbling about stops and it's just a straight line, that's where it landed at that instant there. But actually, that was the little telescope, and they were only doing that for fun, because they were interested in the mission, that tracking. What they were actually really doing was the men from Cheltenham and the women from Cheltenham were here, and they were spying on a Soviet spacecraft called Luna 15. So not that well-known a story, probably, that at the same time that Apollo 11 was on the moon, in fact, at the same time that the Armstrong and Aldrin, the two astronauts, they were sitting in the lander again, waiting to take off and come back to the orbiting part of the spacecraft. While they were sitting there waiting, this Soviet mission, which was a robot, there were no people on it, they'd sort of gone down the line of sending robots rather than people, that actually crashed into the surface of the moon. And that it was intended to bring back a sample of the moon's surface robotically, scoop it up, and bring it back to Earth for analysis. And things could have been very different. Armstrong and Aldrin could have been stranded on the moon and died on the moon. The president of the USA had an announcement already written to commemorate them if that were to happen, and the Soviets could have landed the robotic lander, scooped up the soil, brought it back to Earth, got all the scientific results from the moon without risking anybody's lives, and that would have been a massive coup for the Soviet Union, of course. In the end, it was the other way around. Apollo 11 was successful, the Soviet Luna 15 crashed. Let's just see if this recording of Sir Bernard plays.
This is Monday, July the 21st, and the time is 15:40, 32 seconds, British Summer Time. The American astronauts are in their spacecraft after a walk on the moon and are due to lift off from the lunar surface in about just over 2 hours' time. Meanwhile, the noise we hear is from the Lunar 15, which is now beginning its 50-second orbit. The period was still further reduced an hour ago, so it is now orbiting the moon 1 hour 53 minutes, and there has just been a rumor from a well-informed source in Moscow that this lunar is going to land this evening and return samples of lunar rock to the Soviet Union. Well, that we believe to have been the landing of Luna 15, and meanwhile in the background you'll hear the voices of the Apollo astronauts on the moon. We think that the landing has taken place in the Sea of Fertility, that is close to the Sea of Tranquility. The time now is 15:57:01 seconds. I say, this would really be drama of the highest order.
Sorry, I just love the quote of this. It's really been drama of the highest order. Though that recording is actually from a tape that would have been the tape that was recorded for the benefit of the analysts at GCHQ and in the US intelligence agency that would have been sent. And that's why he keeps putting timestamps in. And they were very interested in seeing what was happening with these signals. We found those tapes in a cupboard in a cardboard box in a cupboard at Jodrell Bank a few years ago. Copies of them. True story, but yeah, they would have originally been sent off to the intelligence agencies. This is what, at the moment, is the only evidence I have for the final secret mission of Jodrell Bank. Of course, I couldn't tell you if there was a current secret mission, and I happen to know about it, but I don't. So you can believe me. The final mission I'm aware of is this one from 1983. And basically, this is Graham Smith's writing, Sir Francis Graham Smith, who was the director who took over after Lovell and was therefore brought into the secret intelligence information. And it says, this was the visit of a huge NASA trailer to Jodrell, ostensibly for SETI, but including a search for new radio signals from Russian spacecraft. So basically this trailer, there's a picture here of it in the USA. I don't have a picture, I haven't found a picture of it at Jodrell. That was brought to Jodrell Bank. It had a specialized radio spectrometer that split the radio signal into a spectrum with 1 million channels or more. And basically they made up a story that they were using it to search for extraterrestrials, and in reality what they were doing was trying to detect these signals that they'd been looking for 21 years. And at Jodrell Bank they finally found them, and Bob told me that his quote was, the Americans were cock-a-hoop when they found this thing, that they'd finally found this signal, that they thought they must have this technology but they couldn't find it, and they found it at that time. So it's possible there's been other stuff that I haven't been told about, but this is what we have so far, and quite a lot of what I've told you wasn't known about publicly until just the last few years. I want to just finish with a little slide about Bob, just to acknowledge his contributions here. This is some of the things he told me before he died last year. About once he was allowed to talk about these things. His sort of summary was that the Ministry of Defence went to the practical people, he described them. The practical people were the people who worked at GCHQ who could do stuff with the technology. And then GCHQ went to Jodrell's designated practical person, which was Bob. So for this project, Bob was the practical person at Jodrell Bank. So he set things up for the men from the ministry, he called them. But he didn't always know what they were looking for, so he'd set things up. He wasn't quite sure what they were looking for. He would have known sometimes he'd have set things up and then just had to go out of the room, and they'd have been doing something and he wouldn't know, but he'd have got the telescope working. He said he got his dog license, which apparently is what they called the Official Secrets Act. They're sort of allowed to know these secret things. He got his dog license in March 1962, and he was very proud of the pass which allowed him to move around the GCHQ headquarters unaccompanied. In other words, he was a trusted person. But he also said, and I think it's worth thinking about this and back to those times, it was a very difficult time for him personally. He had to think carefully about what he was allowed to say depending on who he was talking to. So he had to all the time, and of course you get pressure from people like me who were around at the time. It'd be constantly badgering, "Oh, what's the telescope pointing at today, Bob? I see you pointing at the moon. Is there what's going on? Are you looking at that Russian spacecraft that got launched?" And of course he couldn't, he just couldn't say. So there was a lot of pressure on him, and he took that job very seriously. I'd like to just finish by sort of thanking him for his work, which I think is important work, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.